Okay, I think we've slowed down significantly, and if anybody comes on in the next few minutes, they will miss me and not the important words of our of our panelists. So I think it'll be okay. My name's Corinne Mason. I'm a professor of women's and gender studies at Mount Royal University, and I'm one of the co-directors of the Critical Queer and Trans Research Hub. And I'll hand it over to Celeste to introduce yourself.
And my name is Celeste Pang. I'm an assistant professor in the Women and Gender Studies program at MRU and the other co-director of the Critical Queer and Trans Research Hub.
Well, thanks so much for joining us for this panel. We're really excited to talk about the impacts of AI, the impacts of bots and false responders, and all the ways in which our data collection online is being challenged by a variety of new technologies, and also a particular kind of targeting of 2SLGBTQIA plus research in this strange timeline that we're all living in. And so as the Critical Hub, we'd like to thank you all for being here, for joining us. And we'd like to specifically thank the Mount Royal University Faculty of Arts, the Endeavor Fund, for funding this event today. For folks who are with us at Critical for the first time, we are a research hub that's dedicated to community engagement, to collaboration, to finding ways of connecting communities on our campus and beyond our campus through knowledge sharing, education, and providing what we think is really important evidence-based expertise as we face all kinds of new challenges in Alberta and outside of our provincial context. As a center, we have two directors. We have a variety of faculty affiliates, and we are a fairly new research center. We're just over 2 years old, and so we're very grateful for the opportunity to share space with you all today and to share a space with our fantastic panelists. Mount Royal University acknowledges the relationships to the land, all being songs, stories, and teachings of the Sitka Nation, the Piikani Nation, the Kainai Nation, the Thicastoni Nakota Nation, consisting of the Chiniki, the Bearspaw, the Goodstoney Nations, the people of the Tsuut'ina Nation, and the Métis. And I think it's really important for us at Critical, and for myself personally, to go beyond just recognizing that the land that we are on is occupied, stolen, that we've broken treaties, and to actually work with Indigenous communities around land back movements, Indigenous sovereignty movements, and commit to nation-to-nation conversations, dialogues, and research opportunities. And so we're very grateful as uninvited guests to be here on Treaty 7.
Thank you. So I think, perfect. So as the title of the panel indicates, today's panel is focused on AI, false responders, and lessons from 2S LGBTQIA plus research. So as we were telling the panelists shortly before you all joined us, we were inspired to convene this panel after reading an article in The Conversation that was authored by Chris, Evan, and Hannah Maitland, published earlier this year. So that's called AI Can Affect Anonymous Surveys. Here are some ways for researchers to mitigate its impact, if anyone's interested, as well as our involvement with community-based organizations who are doing large-scale surveys and meeting a lot of these challenges and finding some strategies around them. We also wanted to extend our institution's focus on AI beyond the classroom to think about implications for research and also queer and trans research in particular. So we have 4 amazing panelists joining us today. So I will introduce them, and then we will spend the rest of the time hearing from them and their expertise. So if you just want to give a wave as I say your name. Evan Vipond is a PhD candidate in gender, feminist, and women's studies at York University. They are currently working as a research officer for the Open Digital Literacy and Access Network, or ODLAN, and are a project coordinator at Queer Momentum. Christopher Dietzel conducts research at the intersections of technology, safety, health, gender, and sexuality. His projects broadly explore the barriers, harms, and violence that people face when using digital platforms like social media dating apps. Notably, Dr. Dietzel is leading a grant to study AI in dating apps, focusing on the experiences of LGBTQ+, BIPOC, and neurodivergent individuals. Very cool. Ben Klassen is a queer white settler living on unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Peoples Territories. He is an associate director of research at the Community-Based Research Center, or CBRC, a national nonprofit where he co-leads health research with and for diverse 2S LGBTQIA+ communities across the country. And last but not least, we have Ren Lo, who is a social epidemiologist at CBRC and co-leads the Quantitative Population Health Research Program there. Ren has research interests in exploring intersectional experiences and health outcomes among 2S LGBTQIA+ communities, public health surveillance, and creative applications of data visualization. Based in BC, Ren holds an MPH from Simon Fraser University. So really excited to have all of you here. Thank you for taking the time. Note to the folks who are attending, we are also recording this panel, so it will be available for further dissemination if you have friends or colleagues who weren't able to take the time today. So we have 3 prompts for the panelists. The first one we'll ask in order for Evan, Chris, and then Ben on behalf of Ben and Ren to respond, and then we'll move more organically. So to begin, can you please introduce what your research and your methods are, and maybe give us 1 or 2 examples that you'd like to speak to as part of the panel?
Sure, thank you. So the most recent research project that I was working on with the Open Digital Literacy and Access Network was called Digital Resilience, addressing the rise of transphobic online hate through community-based research. And that's where our data collection phase that prompted us to write the conversation piece came from. So for that project, we used mixed methods, which included an online survey, one-on-one interviews that were conducted virtually, and then a literature review as well, and data analysis. And this project came out of a previous research project that Odlin had done that was focusing more broadly on queerphobic online hate, targeting queer organizations. And for that project, there was a survey and focus groups, again, virtually conducted. And that sort of really prompted us to look at transphobic online hate in particular, because that was one of the key findings, was that that was one of the most prominent forms of online hate. And so I'd love to talk more about the Digital Resilience Project, and specifically some of the challenges we faced with the survey and receiving what we can't 100% confirm, but assume are sort of the use of bots or AI generated responses that were linked to a specific IP address, and how we might be able to mitigate in the future these kinds of responses, but also some of the strategies we used for going through the data and trying to clean the data so that we could keep responses that we felt were accurate, and essentially disregard the ones that we felt were false responders. So that's what I'll focus on today. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris.
Yes, thank you for the question. I actually don't have tons to add since Evan and I were doing this research project together, but as they mentioned, we did take a mixed methods approach, so there are both qualitative and quantitative components. This was an online survey. It was actually the second iteration. We did this in two iterations. We sent out the survey and then redid it specifically because of this concern around like infiltrated data on the part of like AI or bots. So we can talk once we get more into the actual conversation. We'll be happy to talk specifics about how we approach this issue, some of the learning lessons learned that came from doing this project. But then in my own research, which you cited, Celeste, I'm doing a project about AI and dating apps. And so for that, some of the methods that I use to study AI differently in terms of research methods are like non-participant observation. So there's a method called the walkthrough method, where you actually like use different social media platforms or digital platforms and go through what regular use would look like, from downloading to inputting information to using the app and its different features to deleting it. So that entire process kind of can give people a sense of what it's like from a research perspective to analyze the different features. But then there's also understanding the context in which it's used. So that's just one example, but in short, I just want to say in terms of other research methods, I engage with digital research methods like that particular one, as well as participatory research through like focus groups or using arts-based methods, which is less relevant here as we're talking about AI, but could be a creative way to think about how we might actually push back against technology and really ground our work in the communities that we intend to serve. So thank you.
Thank you. And Ben and Ren, if you wanted to chime in, but I think you were going to respond together.
Sure, yeah. So both Ren and I work at the Community-Based Research Center, which is a nonprofit organization that's committed to advancing the health and well-being of 2SLGBTQ+ folks across Canada through research and intervention development. And our work is really focused quite broadly on 2SLGBTQ health. So it includes, a focus on things like HIV and sexually transmitted and bloodborne infections, but also a lot of other domains of health, including things like mental health, reproductive health, chronic health, and things like community connections. So we're really thinking quite holistically about health at CBRC and exploring that through a range of qualitative and quantitative methods. So while we're probably best known for some of our large-scale population health studies, we also do a bunch of qualitative work as well. And I think we've actually seen, AI and bots across that spectrum of work. So I think we'll be able to talk, specifically about some of the survey pieces that have come up and some of the challenges we've seen there, but also how that actually is also impacting some of the, the questions around data quality and recruitment for qualitative work as well. So a couple of the studies that we've been running recently at CBRC are the Sex Now survey, which we've been running since 2002 and is really focused on HIV and sexually transmitted and bloodborne infections, and the Our Health study, which had a larger focus on chronic health and on COVID-19 impacts in our communities. And one other thing to flag that I think we can get into the weeds on as the conversation kind of progresses is that we've also done some of these large-scale survey studies, both online and in person. So we've sometimes gone into the field, gone to Pride events and Two-Spirit powwows and other places where 2SLGBTQ people might gather, and then recruitment in those settings as well. And more recently, we've also tried to deploy a hybrid approach where we're both recruiting in person and online, and we can reflect on some of the learnings that emerged there. I think just like one other thing to just flag at the outset here is just like around our online recruitment methods, we've kind of used a variety of different approaches to try to engage as diverse of a set of our communities as we can. So that's included, deploying our network at CBRC through our website, our newsletter, our social media presence, but also our really vast network of community-based organizations across the country who are doing frontline work and might be more recognizable to local 2SLGBTQ communities. So, leveraging their social media presence and their networks as well as like doing advertising on social media, which we can definitely, we probably will want to chat about at some point because there are some really interesting conversations there, and on sex apps and dating apps as well. We've kind of tried it all. Like we've tried, like using influencers as well, like drag queens, for example. And there's been some really interesting learnings across a bunch of these different modalities. So I'll just leave it there for now and look forward to digging into some of these pieces in greater depth.
Thank you. And for folks in the audience, I believe the chat is the chat is disabled, but the Q&A function is enabled. So if you have questions as we go along, Corinne and I will moderate those, and we will spend a chunk of time addressing those questions as part of the webinar. So don't be shy. So I'm hearing so far, we're talking about AI and strategies to use it and mitigate potentially negative impacts through like recruitment to engagement to the cleaning of data on the other end. So I'll tell you both questions so the audience knows where we're going, and we'll start with the first. So how has AI and/or hateful targeting impacted online data collection? So if you can speak to some specific examples of those impacts. And then after that, we will get into some of those lessons learned and mitigation strategies and tactics that you're willing to share with everyone. So yes, first to the impact. How has AI and hateful targeting impacted your data collection and specifically online data collection? Whoever unmutes can go first.
Evan, do you want to? I know you and I have a lot to say about this, so would you like to? Yeah, why don't you get started?
Sure.
I'm
And
calling on
then,
Evan because they led the project, and so I'll jump in as needed. But Evan really spearheaded this work, so thank you for that.
sure, yeah, and please jump in if I leave anything out. But I would say for us, what one thing we noticed is our online survey was very targeted in the sense that we were looking specifically to hear from two-spirit, trans, and non-binary folks working for queer organizations in Canada, which is a very narrow criteria in terms of these kinds of surveys. And within the first 24 hours, we received 1,491 responses, which was probably 10 times what we expected to receive throughout the entire 4 to 6 weeks that the survey was going to be open, just for context. So immediately we knew something was going on, that we weren't just receiving sort of honest responses, mostly because there just couldn't be this many already. And so we sort of paused the survey in terms of collection to look at what was happening. And there were a few key things that popped out. So we don't know for sure how technology was being used, in the sense of whether someone was using AI to generate the responses, for instance, and then inputting them, or if it was an automated bot that was perhaps prompted to respond to the survey over and over. So it's challenging to know in that sense, but I would say that it didn't appear hateful in this context. None of the responses were, they weren't transphobic responses. They weren't hateful responses. They were they seem to actually make a lot of sense in the context. Like, they seem to be answering the questions we were asking. But as we reviewed them, we noticed they were very vague responses that were sort of repeating the question back almost in answer form. So if it was, have you experienced transphobic online hate? What does this look like? It was, yes, we've experienced a lot of transphobic online hate, but remained quite broad. And then we also noticed that a lot of the responses were coming from an IP address that was located in China. And again, we had multiple responses from the same IP address, so that was a flag. And the most interesting, I think, part was when we started to sift through the demographic information. And that's when really we saw, okay, there must be some kind of AI component, because they didn't seem to be able to respond to the demographic questions in a consistent or coherent way. And one of the things we noticed was that, for instance, they might answer yes when asked, are you First Nations, Inuit, or Métis? But then when asked to select their race or ethnicity, almost all selected white. And again, even though there can be, there are a lot of complexities there for such a huge number of folks to have the exact same sort of inconsistency becomes a flag. And again, we noticed a lot of people were supposedly from PEI, which, if you actually know the population of Canada, you would, again, that becomes a flag. So there were all these inconsistencies, or where they wouldn't be able to answer the writing questions when it came to gender identity, pronouns, things like that. So these were some of the flags, but the challenging part was that we had all this data and we needed to figure out what could be used and what couldn't be. And so that took a lot of time, because we didn't want to lose the data that we could use. We didn't want to throw out sort of responses that were being shared by folks genuinely, but we also didn't want to include false data. Yeah, is there anything you want to add there, Chris?
Yeah, just on that note, yeah, we had also, in terms of like data cleaning, in addition to these type of contradictions, which, just to add on to what Evan was saying, we really wanted to, one challenge that can happen with online surveys or data collection, particularly when it's quantitative, is that this research can be hard to do with an intersectional approach, because people often have to categorize themselves in one box or another. And so particularly there where queer identities are involved, where trans identities are involved, to box yourself into one specific category can often challenge or complicate intersectional research. So while recognizing that, as Evan mentioned, there might be these contradictions, we really wanted to approach this in a way that did not, that would not potentially negate the intersectionality that we wanted to apply to this research. So that was kind of a methodological challenge, and we had numerous conversations around this to be like, okay, on one hand, and to build on that, we also want to recognize how with research, there's often barriers for certain communities involved, particularly those who are trans or indigenous, racialized, who sit in multiple marginalized, who have multiple marginalized identities. So there again, we did not want to remove people from the research if we believe this to be legitimate representation and involvement from communities who A, don't necessarily always have their voices heard, but then B, are hard to get involved into academic research. So these were some really critical conversations that we had while, again, dealing with these problems, but also trying to live out the values that we were applying to this research. Evan, I don't know if you have anything else more you want to add in that regard.
I guess just to note that we did, we tried to use as many different sort of criteria as possible to narrow down whether a response was seen as valid. So one piece of what might, again, appear contradictory in terms of the demographics wasn't necessarily enough to say, okay, then this is a false response, because we knew that there are these, it is very nuanced, and completing demographic information can be very challenging for some folks. But when we saw that there were multiple red flags, that's when we'd sort of say, okay, so there's inconsistencies here. There's also the piece of perhaps responding too quickly or not responding to certain questions, IP address, location, things like that.
Yeah, and actually just brought up another one. Time in particular is a good one that you can very easily assess with online surveys. So since we had done this through Qualtrics, is that what we did? I forget which.
This one was SurveyMonkey.
Thank you. This was through SurveyMonkey, but still, nonetheless, it keeps track, of course, of how much time people take, the completion time. And so what we were able to do is really weed out those that are called speeder responses, aka those who go too quickly, or flatliner responses, where somebody would answer the same question using like the same formula, kind of as Evan alluded to earlier. So by looking at the average time that it took to complete the survey, we were then able to identify what these what are they called? Like the far-reaching ones. There's a word that's escaping me right now. The outliers. Thank you. We were able to identify the outliers and then remove them, of course, if it's not physically possible to, do a survey within 2 or 3 seconds, for example. So time was another factor that really allowed us it was another factor that allowed us to remove those that were deemed potentially infiltrating answers.
There's a question from someone in attendance asking if there was a financial incentive for your survey.
Yes, so that's
Yes.
Oh yeah.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Evan.
That's one thing we noticed as well. One of the things that surprised us, though, was that there was essentially survey respondents would be entered into a draw. So there was no guarantee of receiving the incentive. And so one of the things we have been thinking about was, because this sort of huge influx of responses we got all at once that were tied to the same IP address, as we think it was sort of the strategy of, if one person or one group sort of responds enough times, then they have a higher likelihood of winning the draw. So it was also, though, a bit surprising at first, for me anyways, that much effort would be put into something you might not even get. And so in this case, we do think we were able to remove all the false responses. And so even though the odds may have been that they should have, or they would have expected maybe to win some of the draws, then they ended up not. So even in the case of it being not guaranteed, that was still likely a big motivation.
Ben and Ren, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit about this. Yeah, I think that for CBRC, we've done a lot of surveys over the past 2 decades, and definitely like AI has made online recruitment much more challenging over the years. We've done, many different types of inclusion criteria as well. Like we used to be a lot more narrow, and now in the recent year, like we've opened up our inclusion criteria to include anyone in the queer community that can self-identify that way. But definitely over the years, we've seen like AI has become more and more of an issue over these iterations. And generally, it's really just increased the amount of time and resources required to conduct data cleaning and remove the bot and fraudulent responses. Maybe 5 years ago, even like we wouldn't really have to worry about that so much just because we wouldn't have the technology wasn't there to impact it in this way. Rather compared to now, our data cleaning process just gets longer and longer and longer. With each survey, it's now about 3 or 4 months that we probably take to actually go through everything and manually go through all of these responses, considering that our surveys are also usually, we get about maybe 4,000, 5,000 people sometimes, so they're quite a large sample size. But also if we don't do this, then these false responses, undermine the quality of our data. And definitely it's interesting about to hear Evan and Chris, you talk about the different incentive for the prize draw, because, even this year we had, we ran Sex Now in the spring, and then we ran another survey, Our Bodies, Our Health, in the summer. And both of these surveys actually had like a different incentive. So Sex Now was a prize draw versus Our Bodies, Our Health was a cash incentive, $10 for every respondent. And we did see a very different distribution of the of bots across these two surveys, where Sex Now, we actually like didn't really get any bots or fraudulent or malicious responses as compared to Our Bodies, Our Health, where we kind of saw that a bit more over the summer. And so, we thought like maybe it's because the cash incentive was more accessible. It's 100% people will be able to get it, even though it's a smaller amount of money. Maybe it's to do with the marketing, where like we did share that that we would give the $10 incentive on all of the marketing materials and social media. So maybe that's why bots were able to find our survey. But yeah, so generally, like I think that we found one of the learnings from this year was that like being really careful about how we market the incentive is really important. Just because marketing it too much tends to attract bots or fraudulent responses. Again, the use of AI and the large language models like ChatGPT, if people are just inputting responses in the open text questions. And another thing that we found that helped was when we do both in-person and online recruitment together, having different links for each of the surveys is helpful. So kind of actually separating the surveys altogether, so that if we see a lot of bots in the online survey, at least we still can preserve the data quality of the in-person recruitment method. So then we can kind of like, yeah, just like make sure that we don't have to data clean as much, but also like, protect the data there. So yeah. Ben, if there's anything you want to add about that.
I mean, I think like the incentive piece is so interesting because obviously it's like this kind of collision of our principles with like the realities of doing recruitment in an online setting now, because we want to compensate our communities for, sharing parts of their lives with us. Like this is like just as a values-based piece is really important to us. But we're seeing that that's really leading to all sorts of challenges in terms of uptake by bots. And so it's just a really interesting thing for us to be navigating as a team together. I mean, this is like a little bit separate from some of the things we've been talking about already, but I think like very much part of this context is also just that we have experienced just like greater challenges, I guess, in terms of online recruitment just generally over the years. So we used to be able to recruit, many thousands of participants through Sex Now, for example, through modalities that are now kind of yielding, fewer and fewer participants. So I think it's just because like the context of online recruitment has shifted so much. So I mean, like one of the examples I can think of is like we used to recruit thousands of participants quite easily through Meta, for example, through Facebook and Instagram. And those platforms are now a hellscape for queer and trans people, right? So it's really hard to target people on those platforms now based on 2SLGBTQ identities or interests. But we're also receiving all sorts of hateful messaging and backlash when we try to expand our networks on social media. And so I think that's a piece that we're also navigating here as well. And then when we think about like sex apps or dating apps, it's like another important online recruitment method. Like a lot of that space is much more crowded now with a lot of like corporate advertisers who've realized that this is a great way to market to our communities. And so we've also seen, you know, some challenges, I think, emerging in that space as well. And then like thinking through some of these other online recruitment methods, like we've leveraged influencers of all sorts of types. But a challenge there is just that a lot of like drag queens, for example, have a lot of, you know, followers who are not just LGBTQ folks or are living outside of Canada. And so, yeah, I think like it's become harder to recruit real people at the same time that we've also had this like challenge with AI and bots emerging. And so I think it's kind of all part of this kind of larger online context of 2S LGBTQ health research.
Is it okay if we ask a few questions? Okay, there's one question that I think might be quick to answer and is very kind of like practical. And so Rena, I'll put this to you because you were talking about, or actually Evan as well. I think both of you were talking about data cleaning, and there's two questions that are focused on that. So one person saying this might be a silly question, but how do you get the IP addresses? And so I think that's a really pragmatic question and an important one for folks who are kind of digging into this and trying to figure out, where do I start? And then also somebody's asking another kind of pragmatic question to Ren. When data cleaning, are you finding ways of automating it, or are you doing it line by line? And it sounds like with 5,000 surveys, line by line is maybe what takes up those many, many months of data cleaning. But if you, Ren, want to start, and then we can move to other folks if they have other ways of answering those questions.
Yeah, for sure. In terms of IP addresses, we normally administer our surveys through Qualtrics. So for us, we have the option available to for Qualtrics to just kind of automatically track IP addresses for people who are submitting their responses. So it's actually just part of the data set that we get after we download it from the website. So I know that it might look a little bit different if you're using a different survey platform. So maybe Evan, you can speak to what it looks like at SurveyMonkey a little bit. And then in terms of the data cleaning in general, we kind of do a mix. So we have a protocol for data cleaning with like a lot of the different steps that we take and all of the measures that we try to look at. And it's definitely like, you know, we try to follow the protocol that we have and automate it where we can. But a lot of it does end up sort of being line by line, especially when we're looking at all of the open text responses and trying to figure out like, oh, is this like an honest response, or like, is this something that looks a little bit suspicious, or it's not answered properly? There is definitely that manual component, but we do try to automate it like where possible and at least follow the same rules with every survey that we have. So I would definitely recommend before doing the survey to make sure that you have like a really robust data cleaning method, and like really think through how are you going to use all of the different measures, how are you going to use all of the different bot detection tools or questions that you're going to ask, so that you can actually pivot or change or just kind of like know what you're doing like when you actually get the full data set.
So for SurveyMonkey, it was similar in the sense that SurveyMonkey can track the IP address. So when you go in to look at the data, it says, you know, date, time period, you can select for IP address, and then essentially you can, you do have to manually look up where those IP addresses located, but it also then is easy to spot the same IP address if the same IP address has been used for multiple responders. And you can also then block specific IP addresses. So one IP address we did block because we had gotten about 1,000 responses from that IP address. So then you can go in and block that. And one of the other things we added as well after was a password that would be very easily guessable, but not necessarily guessable by AI, because it was asking what country are you located in. And in this case, it was for Canadians or people in Canada. So you had to answer Canada. But a bot might not be able to answer it, or might answer a different country. So that was another thing we added as well.
And actually, I might say one more thing about IP addresses. Recently, one member of our team was really looking into IP addresses and how you can look them up to see where they're from. And they're not actually quite as accurate as we would think that they are. A lot of times, really, the highest accuracy is, of course, like the country where it's from. But the other parts of it, that narrow it down to city or neighborhood, are actually not really that accurate in terms of like a geographic location. So I would maybe caution away from like putting too much stock into like the really like fixed area, and just kind of look at it from like a country perspective. And of course it's always a little bit difficult because folks might be using like VPNs or something, and I think we're still trying to navigate like what that might look like, or how we can communicate to participants. Like, okay, if you have an IP address from like another country, maybe like that's something that we can't actually use, or we'll be more careful about using it. So I definitely think being sort of maybe honest in the approach during the survey and telling them that would be helpful. So at least maybe they can turn it off if they want to. But yeah, just think a little bit more, or look into like IP addresses a little bit before you can like really use them in all the different ways you might want to.
Great, thank you. I feel like my question might have interrupted the flow of another part of the moderated discussion. Celeste, are we okay for another question before we really go?
Totally.
I think that
We get into
there's
lessons learned and mitigation. So maybe if we
Yeah.
take these two, and then you
Sure.
can volunteer some lessons learned and strategies, then I'm sure that will generate a lot more specific questions too.
Yeah, absolutely. So Wendy, hi Wendy, is asking, does it help at all to enable CAPTCHA in Qualtrics? I don't know if I said that right, or if I should have said the acronym. CAPTCHA.
CAPTCHA, I think is what
CAPTCHA,
you're,
thank
yeah.
you.
Yeah.
Thank
No
you.
worries.
Yeah,
Can you just repeat the question? Sorry.
sure. So is it helpful to enable CAPTCHA in Qualtrics?
Yeah, so I would say that definitely it is. So there's actually two different modalities for for CAPTCHA on Qualtrics. So there's obviously like the question that we often see like when we use a website or something, where you select the photo or something based on a theme, and that just weeds out people. So if participants can't answer that, then they won't actually be able to proceed through the survey. And then there's also a invisible reCAPTCHA 3.0 score that Qualtrics can assign to each response. That basically is like a measure from Google that determines like, oh, how likely is it that this person is a bot or is like AI or something. So I think based on Google's recommendation, any score above 0.5 is considered not a bot. So like, yes, that can be helpful, but also like reading about it and understanding like Google doesn't have all of the details about how they assign the score. Sometimes it's related to whether you're using Google Chrome, or like how well your internet is connected. But it's like definitely like one strategy that you can use to be able to filter out people in case you're worried about it.
There's also this like ironic point that CAPTCHA is being used to train AI. So I'm just going to throw that out there, but that is part of this too. And I will also say we use this in our in-person survey for Our Bodies, Our Health, and I also failed it sometimes. So it's definitely not a perfect measure, and it's very humbling to be deemed a bot.
Amazing. Now that I have heard you say what it is, I'm like, yes, I know what that word is. Thank you. Okay, so another question about IP addresses, and I'm just going to keep us there before I move on to a broader kind of question, which is maybe a bit more qualitative data capture than quantitative. But another IP address question, would Qualtrics detect the use of a VPN or a proxy?
No, so Qualtrics would not be able to detect that. And basically, like when you get the IP address, like and you try to look it up or something like on a website or online, it really depends on that database that you're looking it up in and what it says. And that's why like an IP address lookup tool like isn't really that accurate, because like each of the databases might say something a little bit different about where that IP address is coming from. So definitely like that's why it's better to like be careful about how you're saying you're going to be using the IP address and what you're using it for, and maybe just using it for country. But yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So the next two questions are about focus groups. And so I'll try and do my best to maybe put them together. So one person is talking about holding some focus groups and are wondering about how to mitigate false responders because people are getting smarter. This person says, I had one using a deep fake video on Zoom, and it seems everyone looks like a false responder these days. So that's cute. And Anna is asking about online focus groups. What would you do if you suspected there's a fraudulent participant? How do you deal with managing, cleaning, and analyzing the data after? And as somebody who has had, I think, false responders in online interviews in the kind of COVID context, I'm very curious about both these questions. So thank you for asking.
Yeah, I'd be happy to get us started, and others, of course, please jump in. It's a great question, and yeah, unfortunately, it seems like, I mean, just as we're talking about here, AI and false respondents it seems like it's more and more a problem. Just to be clear with like, when we're thinking about false respondents, it's actually a problem that we've dealt with on other work that Evan and I have conducted through Odlin. So there was a project a couple years ago where we wanted to do focus or individual interviews, again with queer and trans folk here in Canada, and we had a whole bunch of people express interest, and we were going to do interviews, and I was actually the one who was doing the interviewing, and it became immediately clear in the first couple of interviews that I did that these were people who did not live in Canada, who did not have a familiarity with the research, who were, and now throw back to another question that was asked, who were only participating in this research because of the financial compensation that we were offering to participants. And again, although we were trying to make this accessible and equitable, respecting people's time, compensating them for their expertise, it was very clear very quickly that people were trying to take advantage of that. And so what we ended up doing, that happened on this project with Odlin, but then this also happened in another research project that I did with a different research team, where once again, we were infiltrated, whether by bad actors or bots or whatever the case may be, for focus groups. And we found that people were, again, just interested because of the financial compensation. And so what we did for both of these actually was we decided to do like a pre-focus group. Essentially, it was just like a filtration process, quite simply, is where we would meet the individuals before doing the real interview, kind of like a pre-interview, basically. And we just had like 3 to 5 basic questions to not see if people can give us a right or wrong answer in terms of their identities or experiences, but just to see if they were authentic in terms of the relationship to the research topic that we were wanting to investigate. So for instance, like asking very obvious, easy questions. And we've particularly framed this under the guise of testing technology. So having like a 5-minute Zoom call just to make sure that everything works, to make sure that there aren't any problems with connectivity, to make sure that the participant didn't have any questions about the research before going to the focus group, for example. And so that process was actually, it was very, very useful to actually then, in a 5-minute individual interview, this brief connection, to then identify and then remove those who might have otherwise been bad actors or infiltrate the data in like the actual data collection. Granted, I do recognize that this requires more work on the part of researchers. There's labor involved in terms of having 5-minute calls with all potential participants before doing the actual research itself. But that we found was more or less the most effective and best strategy to ensure that it didn't later compromise the data collection.
Yeah, I'm happy to share. I mean, I think some similar learnings to what Chris has already shared, but we often will use online screeners to screen people into qualitative sub-studies or qualitative studies in general. And that's like important for a few different reasons. It's obviously, we want to make sure that folks are actually eligible for the study that we're doing, but we're often not like trying to really center the experiences of intersectionally marginalized folks in our communities in a lot of that qualitative work. And so we're doing very intentional recruitment from the people that are completing those screeners. And unfortunately, I think a lot of like fraudulent responses tend to play into that. So I think people will often select, more marginalized identities. And that makes it harder to actually like recruit folks, who are real into some of these qualitative sub-studies. And so similarly to Chris, I think what we've been moving towards increasingly at CBRC is doing more of that screening verbally, having at least part of the screening process happen in a conversation over the phone, where you can just ask them, like, you can ask very basic questions about, like, what is your interest in this topic? And building that into your ethics protocol, because that is something that's quite important too, is that we want to obviously stay in the bounds of our REB protocols. So I think that's something that we're going to be increasingly moving towards at CBRC, maybe a hybrid screening approach. Even having a good open text question in the screener can make a big difference too, right? So if you ask something that's a little bit more open-ended, you can assess that for some quality as well. So those are a couple of the things that we're trying out in terms of that piece. And I think it's really important to do this filtering up front, because just to the other kind of part of this question that was asked, like, having a fraudulent responder in a focus group setting is really not great, because not only is it going to be like weeding out that data from that person, but it's absolutely going to impact the safety of the other folks in the group. I'm not going to feel willing to share my personal lived experience related to a potentially, challenging topic if I suspect that one of the people that's in that focus group is a bad actor, or somebody who is not who they say they are. So I think we really have to try to navigate this as much upfront in the process as we can.
So moving to successful mitigation efforts, I'm just thinking how to break this up. So there's been some talk so far about recruitment strategies and how you're pivoting your recruitment. Ben, you mentioned like what it means to have relied on like Facebook in the past, or being able to enter dating apps, and also kind of sussing out if people are false responders or not. So are there any other strategies folks would like to share, maybe starting at that recruitment piece, as to how you've pivoted because of AI and false responders? And then two, if there are any other strategies you've used at that recruitment base to try to weed out false responders. Like, Ben, if you're not going to Facebook anymore, Ren, like where are you going? Or how are you reaching those networks that are no longer available?
Yeah, I feel like, Ren, you should start that part.
Sure, yeah. So at least this year, we originally started one of our surveys, Our Bodies, Our Health, as like a fully sort of like one combined survey for in-person and online. It's just one survey on Qualtrics, and we just sent the same link out to everybody. And then we also use the same link for the in-person. And after we discovered some bots in our data set, we basically had to pivot halfway through to doing snowball sampling. So we restricted the online recruitment and just like focused on the in-person, and also kept like a new online survey link that was just shared to folks through like postcards on a QR code. So then people were able to do the survey at a Pride event, and then take home like multiple postcards if they wanted to, and like give them to their friends or distribute to family. And we found that that was really helpful, and sort of eliminated a lot of bots from the online recruitment, and still yielded quite a few responses from the online as well. So I would say like that was definitely a successful pivot for us. It eliminated bots, but maybe not the fraudulent or malicious responses or hateful targeting. I'm not sure, depending on who it was shared to. But yeah, that was one way that was really helpful for us. And then maybe like, so definitely also restricting access to survey links in the future if you can password protect it, or create unique links to send to participants or something like that might be helpful if you just have an online survey, to try to like put at least one barrier in place to stop it being so easily, I guess, like bot farmed if that happens to you. Yeah.
Sorry, if I can just add something else. Just Renan, listening to you, you reminded me of another project that I'm on, where we investigate technology facilitated sexual violence among youth, specifically teenagers like 13 through 18. And with sexual violence being such a difficult topic, even though we've employed students to help us analyze the data, and we employed transcriptionists to help us transcribe the focus group data into transcripts, what we did as a research practice was we recognized that these types of topics are not only difficult for participants to talk about, whether through a focus group or an online survey or whatever the case may be, So I think oftentimes when we think about research, we think about protecting participants, but I would just add that in this particular project and elsewhere, it's also important to think about the people who do the work. So like thinking about having mechanisms in place to care for the researchers or to care for the transcriptionist. And so making sure that like your research team has mental health supports or can talk to people if ever they're triggered. Or like what we did with these particular students is that if they had experienced an incident of sexual violence, or in some of the focus groups, we did ones based around certain identities or experiences, you know, if there was something that might be ever concern, if there was ever concern about like somebody being triggered, if they were going to be reading a particular transcript or analyzing a particular transcript, all we did was just say, no questions asked, send us a message, we'll we'll redistribute this work based on the team. But I really just want to emphasize that when doing this work, of course, one of the objectives is to make sure that we have good data. Another, of course, is to make sure that participants are safe. But when we do research on difficult topics, we also have to care for our teams. And so I would just encourage folks to think about research ethics in that regard as well.
Yeah, I think that like ethic of care in this work is so important, because I think we often talk about like community-based research and the value add of having folks from our communities leading this work, but there's also additional weight to being involved in that work as folks who are also living in these communities, part of these communities, and engaging with a really extremely challenging political context right now, right? So I mean, the one other thing I wanted to mention, just in terms of like a really big pivot in terms of recruitment methods, is like the idea of doing in-person data collection. So I know this is a panel on online data collection, and I don't want to be like, let's just stop doing that altogether. But there are some benefits, and I think some challenges as well that come with online or in-person data collection. So I mean, certainly this is like a much more time-consuming and expensive form of data collection. If you're planning to go, do a national study across the country, where you're, booking space at Pride events or other community spaces. But I think, there is a very real kind of balance here in terms of, improved data quality when we do that. Some, fewer challenges with some of the issues related to data cleaning, so some of the resources associated with that. And we've also, seen in some of our studies at CBRC, I think we've done 5 national kind of in-person studies in recent years. And we've seen that those samples tend to reach some parts of our communities that we don't reach through online surveys. So, those samples have tended to be more racially diverse, have a larger proportion of trans and gender diverse participants, and also more participants who are immigrants, just to name a couple of factors there. And there are also some folks that we have a more difficult time engaging in those in-person settings too. So I think we kind of need to think about like balancing both of these larger recruitment methodologies. Because for example, we don't tend to recruit as many folks living with HIV or older folks or folks who are less out for obvious reasons if we're recruiting folks at Pride festivals. So there's certainly some trade-offs there. But I think the one other thing that I just want to say about in-person data collection is that it's really this opportunity to have a relational approach to doing research with our communities, because participants talk back to us when we're in that setting. And so not only are we, quite convinced that they're actually part of these communities and we know that they're real people, but they're also going to tell us about what that research means to them, what we maybe need to be prioritizing in future research. And to me, that's just like kind of at the center of doing good community-based work, right? Is trying to open up that space for two-way dialogue with diverse folks in our communities. And so, yeah, I think if we think about research as like a relational praxis, in-person data collection is a really good way of doing that.
If I may, Ben, I'd so agree with you. And I just think, and I recognize that that's not necessarily the topic of this, but I just really want to emphasize that I really agree with you. Because again, when we're thinking about like inclusivity and when we're thinking about equity and accessibility, although many of these online surveys or online data collection methods allow for multiple ways of participation, there can still be limitation for that. For instance, in some of the work that I've done with like neurodivergent groups, doing stuff in front of a screen or having to use, your hands in particular ways in order to manage. there's both visible and invisible disabilities that can come across or can manifest when trying to collect data online that can create barriers for individuals. And so what we've again found in our research or on different projects is like having arts-based methods, as I spoke about before, or having participatory research that allows folks to engage perhaps orally as well as through written means, or to have an interpreter there if there's language concerns. There's also the aspect of community that Ben referred to, and then also reaching out to communities instead of expecting them to come to us when we do research. So that relationship piece is, again, very, very important as well. So while I certainly advocate for, inclusive methods and like online research or online data collection, I think what Ben's getting into and what I want to reaffirm is really thinking about the values that you bring to your project and thinking about how you can both try to achieve your objectives as best as possible while living those values in the way that best serves the communities.
And I wanted to add to sort of return to some of the discussion around recruitment, ways to, I guess, mitigate some of these responses as well. Is one of the things we did is we took off the mention, or we removed the mention of compensation on the social media posts for recruitment, but that information was still available if you actually went to the survey before completing it, so you know that there was the draw, for instance. But we found that then people who would engage with the post saying there was a survey, who would even go to that next step, were more likely to be genuinely interested because it wasn't only tied to compensation. Or if, for instance, there is a bot that's able to basically scan for keywords, then it might not, it wouldn't have that word compensation or incentive to scan for. Another thing we did for the interviews was, because for the one-on-one interviews, we couldn't conduct nearly as many as we could for survey responses. Then we were a little more selective, and we had sent out the recruitment materials through organizational networks. So we were still able to reach, have a broad reach, but because we weren't looking for as many respondents, we didn't necessarily need to be able to reach as many people. So because there was more compensation provided to folks who were doing up to 1 hour one-on-one interview, we did feel they should have that compensation. Then it was passed more through these professional networks. And because, again, that's who we wanted to speak to in this particular case, that made sense. And so we didn't have that many people apply for the interviews. There were a few people we weeded out, but there wasn't as many as a previous project we'd worked on when it was advertised more widely. So that was another way. It's kind of combined with the snowballing, does help reduce those sort of spam respondents, if you will.
Thanks, Evan. I'll invite you all one last time. If there are any lessons learned or mitigation efforts that are glaringly obvious that you're dying to share that you haven't yet, let's open the space to do that now. And then perhaps, Corinne, we can pivot to questions that are coming in. So audience members, also now is your time to add your questions.
I would say one more thing is definitely make sure to monitor your recruitment data and also source referral data. So try to keep track of the social media post, the timing that it comes out, or the emails when they get sent to partners or organizations, and try to see if you see a huge uptick in responses that are a couple hundred or something, then you can kind of know, okay, at least this maybe bots are targeting because of this post or because it's shared in this way, and then you can sort of adjust it accordingly. So that's definitely one thing that we'll definitely, I think, be doing a little bit more of in the future, and also trying to see click-throughs for the links or the QR codes that you share, to see if you can who's accessing it or how many people are accessing it through each of the venues.
I think just one other consideration is that there is a balancing act between some of these strategies and the participant experience of taking a survey. So I think there are other methods that have been identified in the bot mitigation literature around like attention checks, for example, or certain types of repeat questions to ensure that there's consistency across those questions, and then we can remove people. But the reality is that as a survey participant who's a real person, those are really annoying questions to answer and might actually lead to me stopping the survey. And so I think that is just like one other consideration, is how do we balance kind of like trying to ensure that this is like low barrier and somewhat enjoyable for participants, with also like, trying to mitigate some of the bot responses.
Yeah, one thing we did is we had essentially demographic question that we asked at the beginning under eligibility, and then at the end under demographics. And the way it was sort of positioned, it made sense to be in either category or to be in both categories, but that was one easy way that we could just very quickly rule out anywhere that was obviously contradictory. We didn't use it outside of that to make other assumptions, but in the sense if someone said Alberta and then later Nova Scotia, because it was you selected a response, then that was sort of one flag that then we could look and see if there were other red flags as well. So that was one way that we did that, where it wasn't necessarily obvious that we were asking again, because in the first case it was like eligibility because you're supposed to be in Canada, for instance.
Yeah, so what Evan's referring to is trap questions. So where you would have you might ask the same question in two different ways, once at the beginning or once at the end, or like as they're referring to, you can ask about an identity or a physical location, a geographic location. Another could be to ask for like age, like do you fit these eligibility criteria, and it'll click yes to all of these at the beginning, and then at the end you could say please input your birth year. So for instance, that could be another way, in a non-obvious way, to see if there's a 1 year difference in terms of mathematical difference, then that could be understandable. But if then there's a 5-year difference between what they've said their birth year is and the age that they report to be, then that's very obvious. You could say that this person doesn't pass the trap, essentially. Yeah, and what Ben said, there's also attention checks that you can do. So those are a couple different ways that you can use to clean data. Yeah.
Thank you. Should we turn to questions?
Yeah, sure. So I've got 2 questions for the same person, so I'm going to ask them in tandem. What role does anonymity play, both as a protection and as a challenge, in ensuring genuine responses? And this person's also asking about current best practices of verifying participant authenticity in online surveys and interviews. So the first question again is about anonymity. So what role does anonymity play, both as a protection and as a challenge, to ensure genuine responses?
I don't mind starting off, and then if anyone else wants to jump in there. So for the survey responses, it's anonymous. For interviews, it's a little more complicated because the interview process itself sort of prevents true anonymity. Someone in some case will have some sense of who someone is through the recruitment and then taking down the information and speaking with that person. So it's never truly anonymous. It becomes anonymatized, where then all identifiers related to the person are removed from the data. And then often that might even be done by someone else. And then when the data is analyzed, there's no names, but anything else that could be, if someone said, this is my title at this organization, then that would be removed, because that would be very easy to find out who the person is. So in terms of that's sort of how that process works. So it's really important. It does protect respondents who, in many ways, they might be speaking about a scenario or something where they're not supposed to be speaking about it. If they're speaking about, for instance, their workplace, they might fear that if someone were to find out, that they could be there could be retaliation if someone isn't out, for instance, if it has to do with something that could be perceived as legal issue. There's many reasons why it's very important that that data is anonymatized, even if it's not anonymous in the intake process. And in terms of, now I've sort of lost my train of thought a bit with what the other part of that question is there. Sorry. But that I guess what I'm saying is that it's very important for it to be anonymous, but there's often aspects that aren't, the entire process itself isn't anonymous. So making sure that that data is removed after the fact is really important. And I've sort of lost my train of thought there, so I'm going to stop there.
I mean, I think there's good reasons to do things in less anonymous ways and in more anonymous ways would be like the really condensed way of saying this. Like, obviously maintaining confidentiality of the data is like paramount. That's like fundamental to maintaining trust with research participants and with our communities. But there can be rationales, I think, like for different approaches related to this. But the one thing that I will definitely flag is that the lack of an anonymous response option will mean that people that are more likely to be stigmatized and or marginalized are going to be less likely to participate. So we've definitely seen that in some of the survey work that we've done. We've heard that anecdotally in conversations that we've had with participants in the field. And so just from like the perspective of health equity, I think erring on the side of more anonymous response options is really important to ensure that, you know, those folks that do experience multiple forms of marginalization are able to participate more safely in our research.
Is there anybody else who wants to jump in that question, or should I move on? All right, on we go. Okay, so are there current best practices of verifying participant authenticity for online surveys or interviews? And perhaps maybe you can point to particular resources if that's helpful, or we could also collect some resources from you perhaps that you find maybe particularly beneficial in the literature, or perhaps any kind of protocols that your organization uses that are shareable if they're made public in any way. But I wonder if anybody wants to speak to that now.
Yeah, so not for surveys, but if you do any type of like qualitative data collection, such as focus groups or interviews, one good practice, especially to allow participants the ability to perhaps engage in the research, have more control over the research almost, is to allow for member checking. So this is a practice where after you do the focus group or interview, and as Evan was saying, the information is anonymized or de-identified, or even before, depending on how you want to do the process. You can send the transcript back to the participant or participants and ask them to review what they said. And in doing so, then you give them the opportunity to perhaps clarify if they misspoke. You can also then, this also then gives them the opportunity to remove answers if they feel like they didn't actually want to share something, or add on to something if they'd like to clarify. During this process, this can also allow for people to then withdraw from the research. So if perhaps they were unhappy with any part of the process, or just decide that they no longer want to be involved, this is also an opportunity for you as a researcher to check in with them and make sure that they're still okay with everything before you move forward with the analysis and dissemination of results. So this process, again, called member checking, can be a good way, in a sense, to authenticate the data that's collected. Granted, however, in asking participants to do more work, this does create additional labor for them. Some people would then require participation in terms of member checking as a part of this arc to their participation that starts with recruitment and then perhaps ends with member checking. So that would be another argument for why you might want to compensate participants if they're involved in multiple parts of the process, and certainly giving more time. But again, if there's already barriers to research participation, then asking for this additional participation or engagement can be a barrier. So it's not necessary, it doesn't have to be required, but it's an option if you're engaging in qualitative research to do member checking.
I would say that there aren't really best practices for ensuring anonymity or authenticity in survey data. I think that so far, I think it's very much like people are just trying to do their best and trying to like employ a bunch of different strategies that they read about online or that they see in articles. But generally, I think for now, like definitely using many different tools to determine if a person is a bot or fraudulent is the best way to do it, and having as many as possible so that you can sort of like pick and choose or see what you need to do for that. And all of the things that we talked about so far, including the CAPTCHA, the password protecting, the IP address tracking, and like timestamps, duplicates and things like that, trying to enable anything that Qualtrics has or anything that SurveyMonkey has, and then just try to go from there. And then also reviewing a lot of like the open text responses. But do try to sort of make a protocol beforehand and do a sort of a deep dive into like what other folks are doing and what works for people. Because it also might be like different strategies work for like different sample sizes or different recruitment methods. For what works for CBRC and our large samples might not work for like a much smaller sample. So yeah, definitely think a lot about it before you start.
And I think this is why we need to be collaborating across our teams, right? Because we should all be invested in the concept of collecting high quality 2SLGBTQ plus health research. So I think like health data. So I think like finding better ways to collaborate across teams and like having some type of community of practice is how we get to best practices in this sort of work.
Okay. I will go ahead and ask another question. Sarah's asking, how did you frame this to prospective participants? Oh, how would you frame it to prospective participants if you determined that they weren't genuine? And so I guess it's the case of qualitative in-person data collection. Do you simply not invite them to a future focus group?
Yeah, so as I was talking about before, however you might decide to do this, if you have kind of a filtration process, as I was talking about before, where we have like an online check-in before actually doing the focus group, we simply just said, thank you for your interest in the research, or sorry, we're not gonna do the focus group, or we're not gonna invite you. You don't have to. At least from our perspective, if somebody was identified to be a bad actor, we didn't necessarily feel a responsibility to uh, substantiate our argument in any way. We were like, thank you for your interest, but no, thank you. But again, I think that might just be more of like what you and your team decide to do and how you would like to communicate that to folks.
Yeah, you could also frame it as that they're potentially ineligible, so that you did the screener and that just based on the conversation or one of the questions that came up, you're deemed ineligible, or that we've actually hit our cap already. That kind of thing has also been useful, just saying like, oh, we can only have so many folks and we've hit that number now, or we need to ensure diversity of participants, and again, you don't fit that.
Great. Celeste, do you want to jump into the questions?
Sure. So there's a somewhat related question. I think this was referring to the discussion of honoraria. So has anyone experienced any challenges with ethics boards about removing the honoraria? Or I guess where you mention it.
So in our case, because we're still none of the nothing was really changing in terms of eligibility for the honoraria or what we were compensating. It was just one of the social media sort of advertisements. So that didn't seem to be a problem because it was still being mentioned prior to actually participating in the survey itself. You still had to go through the eligibility and consent and say where there was that. So in that case, that wasn't an issue, but we haven't tried to remove or add compensation after ethics in terms of whether or not we're actually giving it.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we've actually ever pivoted in the midst of a study from providing honoraria to not providing honoraria, but we've definitely alternated or shifted to sometimes provide honoraria and not provide honoraria. And our general experience is that if you explain that in a way that makes sense, your REB is going to approve it, right? So like, I mean, REBs are there to help us do research to some extent too. They're not always a hindrance to the work. So Yeah, so that's been like our experience largely.
Yeah, the only time that we've like shifted in the different projects I've worked on, the only time that we've really shifted in honoraria during a project is if, for instance, like on one of our surveys, we said we were originally going to give everybody $5 for participating, and then we moved it to like you're eligible to be one of three who can win an online prize or something along those lines, so that we still are trying to motivate and recognize and thank participants for their involvement, but then not commit if ever we identify somebody who has been a bad actor. So that is actually something that we did on a different research project, where we initially in our recruitment materials posted online, said we're going to give everybody $5. And then once we got hit by these bots and such, we closed the survey. I think put up a subsequent post, said our apologies. We explained what the situation was and said we would really appreciate if folks can, redo the survey if you're actually somebody who's genuine, but said that we'd be changing our honoraria specifically because of authenticity concerns. And we didn't have anybody push back. Thankfully, I mean, I'm sure that could create problems. But again, I think I've repeated myself a few times, but just like on the note of values in research, just being transparent to individuals about why we did this pivot, especially folks in like queer and trans communities, just being clear that it's not for a lack of interest or a lack of respect. It's just because we actually want to protect the quality of the work.
There are two Facebook or Meta related things. So one person is sharing a comment. So on the topic of Facebook, I would recommend federated alternatives such as pyfed.ca or lemmy.ca, as these are Canadian alternatives to Reddit. So just a comment there. And then a question about paid ads on Meta. So someone's asking, I'm curious if any of you have continued to use paid ads on Meta for survey recruitment, especially when trying to target certain groups. I assume that most folks have stopped doing this since Meta's platforms are becoming increasingly harmful places for queer and trans folks and can attract bots rather than genuine responses, but still wanted to glean your insights on this.
Yeah, so on that second, like the question, so we do sometimes still do boosted ads on Instagram and Facebook, but what we've done is really restricted down who those are being boosted to. So while we used to do like these really kind of expensive boosts to a larger audience outside of our immediate like network at CBRC, we now basically just do boosted ads to people that are already following us on Instagram or on Facebook. And so we're spending a lot less money there, and we're also doing this in a much more targeted way. But like I said, like earlier, like we used to be able to do these really large boosted ads and recruit, thousands of people on those platforms. And that is just not, we're basically spending money if we do like a large boost like that on people sending us hateful comments. Those all count as interactions, right? So that's why we've kind of shifted to this more kind of targeted form of social, like leveraging those meta platforms. We did do some recruitment on Reddit as well, just like along the lines of the comment. And great to have some other ideas about some alternatives that we can explore in future online recruitment cycles. So thanks for sharing that.
There's a question about honeypot questions. So do the panelists have any experience they can share about honeypot questions, i.e. questions hidden to survey respondents that bots are able to detect that can be used to rule responses out? I'm not familiar with honeypot questions, so maybe whoever answers can begin by explaining in a different way what those are.
Yeah, so honeypot questions are generally questions that you can put in a survey that would just not be shown to like regular people. So they might like on the source code of the page of the web page like be hidden to regular respondents, but say like be only shown to bots, something like that. At least that's in my experience, like what I think that they are. I personally haven't actually used those in our surveys at CBRC, unless Ben, the older ones, have. I have, when I was looking into it, I kind of got like mixed reviews from what I could see about effectiveness. I mean, I think that's still also kind of tying into our earlier question about best practices. Like bots and AI are like developing so quickly, so rapidly, and they change all the time. And I think the honeypot questions were useful at a time maybe when they weren't as advanced. But it sounds like now when I was looking into Qualtrics options that bots are actually able to see that it's a hidden question and then just skip it and not answer it. So and I'm not sure if maybe other people have found it effective, but that's the main reason why we didn't choose to use that for our survey. And also like some of my friends at the Reaffirm Collaborative at SFU, I think also did try a honeypot question on SurveyMonkey, and it was not effective for them either. So yeah, I'm not sure like whether other folks have other experiences with that as well.
I mean, I also haven't used honeypot question in a project, and I haven't done like a survey actually since the one that Evan and I ran. But it is one that we've talked about, like as I've prepared proposals for other research projects, and we're thinking about doing online methods, just kind of considering like how we might approach it, especially as conversations like ours keep coming up about like what would we do if we have AI or bots or something. And I think for me, it would just I think my recommendation is kind of building off what Ren said, is just like I think what I would recommend is just really having a conversation with your team and make sure that you have multiple mechanisms in place in recruitment, in data collection, in data analysis, just thinking really comprehensively across the different phases of your project so that you're able to assess the quality of the data, have contingency plans in place if A happens or if B happens, and be able to really not just focus on one solution or one response, just to have like a plan A, a plan B, because it's very possible. And those who've done research before know, you plan for one thing and something else happens. So I also just kind of think, and I know Evan can relate to this. I really would recommend having open and honest conversations about like, if this works, great. If this doesn't work, then what do we do? Yeah.
Thank you. And our last question. So asking as a non-expert in data collection, I wonder how you navigate or encounter those cultural spaces where the very idea of valid data is contested by those whose narratives are threatened by accurate data.
I just want to say to this person and all the others who've posed questions, I really love the questions that you're asking. These are fantastic questions, and they're not easy questions. These are questions that many researchers, on the point of like authenticity, these are things that have been, I don't want to say bothering, but these have been almost existential questions that have been bothering researchers for many, many years. So I really, really appreciate how much you all are engaging with these questions and asking us these questions. So thank you. To this point, what comes to mind is, questions about ways of knowing, and not being careful about the colonialism that we might integrate into our work, deciding whose voices are heard, whose aren't. How we decide whose answers are valid or invalid, that certainly rings in terms of, again, a colonial approach to doing research and potential exclusion of communities whose ways of knowing don't align with our own, whether that's Western or non-Western, or if that's Indigenous ways of knowing. It's a challenge, and I think part of that, one solution, I'm not saying it's the solution, but one response to that that I've found on different projects is to make sure that the research team that you have working on these projects comes from different backgrounds and are able to bring different perspectives to the work. No research is perfect. There's always limitations, but if you're able to integrate folks who have different backgrounds, different ways of thinking and knowing, that can help you help a team really do the best as possible, and make sure that the work can achieve its objectives while still being inclusive and really welcoming to different people of different places.
Yeah, for me, just to build on what Chris was sharing, I think this just highlights the importance of doing work in a meaningfully community-based way, and that includes having a really intersectional team. I think like one of the things that it also makes me think about is like there's actually a couple of different risks when we talk about data cleaning and removing bot responses, because like the one risk is that there's bots in the data and the data quality is compromised, and that's bad, obviously. The other risk is that we have a process in place that isn't nuanced enough that we actually end up removing real people who shared parts of their lives with us. And that is also a big, big problem, because that can really undermine our community's faith in the data that we're collecting and the ways that we're, approaching things like data cleaning. So I think that that's just like another kind of strand to hold in this process, and just another reason to really think super concertedly about your process around screening responses and trying to weed out the ones that aren't legit.
Should we wrap it up? We're almost at 1:30.
Yeah, if there's time, somebody just snuck in a last minute question. Is it okay to do one more?
Sure.
I
There's a
feel like
question about a pre-screener for a survey. I think some of you may have addressed this earlier, but have any of you ever utilized a pre-screener for a survey? I'm currently leading a study where we've taken this approach, and it's definitely improved data quality, but it's also impacted our response rates. So Finn from QTHC is curious if you all think it's an effective strategy and if it's worth the trade-off. Pre-screener, yay, nay.
Yeah, I think yes, we've used it, and I think it is really effective, certainly for as a screener. But as you say, there are some folks who then it becomes a deterrent, just in the sense it's one more step of the process. It's a little bit more time and work. And I think ultimately it comes down to the data you're collecting and how important, for instance, sample size is. Is it that you're looking for quantity or quality? I think it really can be case specific, because in certain cases, if you might lose a couple responses, but if you feel that it is, if the data itself is more rigorous or feels like you are more confident in the data set itself, and if it's encouraging, for instance, people who are willing to put more time and energy into the responses, then that might be worth it. If you're looking for as many people as possible and you really are wanting that critical mass, then it might deter people. And so in that particular case, you might say, okay, it's worth it to spend more time on the data cleaning and try and get as many people as possible, even if it means we result in having to weed more people out. And in other cases, again, if you feel, well, what the kind of engagement we're looking for isn't to produce, let's say, statistics, it's to produce more qualitative data, then you might say it's worth it, because then we can trust the data we have more.
And you welcomed us. You want to kick us all out of the meeting?
Yes, it's time to leave. Everyone who's still here, really, really grateful for everybody who attended today. I agree with Chris. Really, really interesting questions. I spent most of my time writing notes that I won't be able to read later, scribbled on Post-it notes. I'm really also very, very grateful to the panelists for both speaking to us and sharing such great ideas and all of your experiences and your lessons learned. And also very, very grateful that you agreed to have this recorded. And so if folks have missed this opportunity to spend time together in this way, we will be posting the recording and we'll send it to all registrants. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Ren and Evan, Ben, Chris, for joining us, for having this conversation. I think we're going to be having more of these conversations. I think this is a really, really great moment to kind of start this process of talking about, like, what are we up to, and how do we protect our research while also remaining very open and with integrity in the communities that we serve. And so, yeah, I'm just really grateful for all of you for spending time with us today. Thank you. There's lots of folks saying thank you on the Q&A as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.